just play it all over from the beginning, and then I'll write down anything else I might think of. In the 1930s, Mr. Taylor was elected mayor of Vancouver. There wasn't much money for the budget, and poor Mr. Taylor got the brunt of taxpayers' frustration and anger. Many civic employees had lost their jobs. My father was one of them. People visited each other's more then, and the political discussions used to be hot and heavy. We thought that Mr. Taylor must be a really horrible man because he got the blame for everything that went wrong. People were always welcome in your home. They didn't have to phone and say, "Can we come over?" or "We are coming over." You could drop in. Of course, you did that at a socially correct time, but you were always welcome at other people's homes. There was no television. Socializing was very important to people. The living room was always kept tidy, and you always had something in reserve in case someone dropped in. It wasn't the custom to wait to be asked, because people were just welcome. Well, in the late 30s, Jerry McGeer became mayor. A new city hall was built. The Lionsgate Bridge to the North Shore was completed, and finally a war broke out and ended the Depression. My parents had many Scottish family friends with children in our age group, and usually they gathered in one of the houses on a Saturday, and we'd probably all have dinner together. All the children would play together inside, outside, everywhere. The parents would sing. They loved to sing, and someone would be they'd start talking about different stories about Scotland, about Canada, about their experiences, and everyone would sit and avidly listen to these stories. They were really fascinating. And of course the discussion would get around to politics, and we'd hear about this rotten Mr. Taylor and the trouble that was caused, by the Depression. It was very, very bad in Vancouver. And of course when Mr. McGeer was elected and things got better, not because of Mr. McGeer, but just because of the circumstances which evolved, everybody thought he was their savior and that everything would be fine from then on. What was it to start to say? Did I talk about? You asked me something.
As was trouble strike. So far, you haven't said anything about whether people suffered in the Depression. You sort of painted a very rosy picture of.
Well, suffered in the Depression. I told her that the young men ate potato peelings.
But you and your family, your
Me and my
friends.
family. Oh my goodness, we sure suffered. We were a large family. An extended family usually. We always had big houses. And we had people would come from the prairies that knew us, knew our family. They'd land on the doorstep. And you knew they had nowhere to go, so you just put another potato in the pot. And there were barely enough potatoes for us at times. Food was very, very scarce. And fuel was scarce. People helped each other as much as they could. But then we had these two ladies came and lived with us. And they were living off us. They had nothing. They couldn't pay anything. And then along came another lady who was just a very distant acquaintance from her parents were from the Hebrides. And she stayed with us. She was very lazy and very, expected more than we could give. And of course, the meals were as good as my parents could provide, but there was the only income coming in at that time was my brother and sister's wages, which were very small, and we all had to live off them. And this one person tried to get through to my father, and she said, "Oh, Dottie, I would just love to have some cantaloupe." She was always whining. So poor Daddy went out and bought her a cantaloupe, and my mother was furious. The only time I've ever seen my father and mother quarrel was over this cantaloupe. Anyhow, my mother said, "That's it. We're going to find her a job. You could get a job as a housemaid in the big houses. You got $2.50 a month, and you worked at least an 8-hour day. And you lived in the servants' quarters, and you were, of course, not fed the same meals. But it was very hard work and very little pay, so Mama took this, she was a young woman, around to all these different people who had advertised. And of course, this girl, her name was Nellie, was determined she wasn't going to find a job. So the woman would say, "Well, all right, I'll hire you." And she'd say, "Oh, just a minute before I go. Is there a place where I can lie down in the morning to have a rest? And I like an afternoon rest, too." Well, of course, she never got the job. So finally, we had to tell her, "You have to get a job." And then there was an older woman came to live with us, and her daughter would, she was from the Fraser Valley, and I don't know just where her daughter lived, but she came to visit and she never went home. She was a lovely old lady, and her daughter would bring potatoes or some meat or something from time to time. And then a strange little man came to visit us, and I still can't figure out how we ended up with him. He was not related to us or anything, but they called him Little John. He was a very short little man, and I didn't like him at all. And I had my sister older than me was small and petite, and I guess this fellow must have been in his 20s, early 30s. My sister was barely a teenager. And he sort of took a fancy to her. He said, oh, when he was rich enough, he would like to marry Margaret. Well, our parents resented that very much. Everywhere we went, of course, whoever was living with us went. We all decided to go to Locarno Beach, that's near Jericho Beach. I guess it's still there in Vancouver, for a picnic. Several of the families gathered there, and we had a big picnic. And this little fellow was there. He spoke Gaelic. He was from a different island than us. And he said he loved to swim and go out in the water. And of course, he had rented one of these funny cotton costumes that came down to your knees. It had a skirt and just a wide strap type of shoulder and pants like shorts underneath. Anyhow, he walked out into the water, and after a while, when it was time to eat, we realized he wasn't there, so of course we ended up getting the lifeguards. He had fallen into one of the quicksand holes. He was drowned. So I always felt rather frightened because I had spoken against him, and then he got drowned, of course. Then there was a fellow came, a nice-looking man, suitcase in hand, arrived at the door, and he says, hello, 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 Donald, to my father. I'm your niece's father-in-law, and she told me that I could stay with you for a few days. Daddy said, which niece? Oh, Margaret in Penticton. Oh, my goodness, come in, come in, come in. So he was shown his room, and he stayed. He contributed nothing, but he had, of all things, it was before the war, but he actually had something similar to foam rubber, and he made insteps, and he tried to sell them door to door, but nobody bought them. But he didn't do too well at all. He was away most of the day, but he was there for his meals. And we hadn't seen this cousin since we had come to Canada, actually. So we got a letter from her saying she was coming down to visit. We thought, oh, lovely, she'll be coming down, because her father-in-law's here. So she came in the house, and she went up to this man who was standing there with his suitcase and all his belongings, waiting to get out the door. He was an imposter. he just heard of Margaret, and it was just a trick. And he had lived free off us for 3 months, which was a pretty mean thing, because I remember eating an awful lot of lamb stew. Of course, food was cheap then. I mean, but even if it was cheap, it would only go so far. But I remember going down with Mama to Woodward's to help her carry home the groceries, and they were heavy. You could get Lake pork for 4 cents a pound. We would get beef stew. Eggs were cheap. We certainly didn't have any of the better cuts of meat. But my brother and sister who were working, Mama would get special meat for them because they were couldn't feed them stew all the time. But we ate an awful lot of lamb stew and cottage cheese. But I guess we didn't suffer too much. But we were the lucky ones. I babysat 2 children. These people were Norwegian immigrants, and this woman's husband was away fishing, and he must have been up at River's Inlet or somewhere. But she never saw him for the whole fishing season. They would go up, and at River's Inlet, they used to get little dories, very rough seas up there. A lot of them lost their lives. There would be a boat would tow them out in these little sort of rowboat things that they had a little sail on them, and the men would fish all day, and later on the boat would come and tow them back in a long line, and they paid them 5 cents a pound per salmon. It didn't matter how small or big they were, but the fish were big then. And then they had to pay for their room and board, so they had hardly any money at all to send home to their families. So this Norwegian woman that Mama had befriended had the 2 children, and she was really hard up, and anyhow she was going somewhere one night, and so Mama volunteered my services to babysit, so I went to look after these 2 children, and they had a basement suite, and it was 2 rooms, and believe it or not, it was a dirt floor. She had a table and about 2 chairs, and the only thing to eat in the house was a can of pilchards, which were still sitting in the can in the cooler, because not many people had fridges in those days. You had an ice box. The ice man came once or twice a week, and you got a big block of ice. Most people had a little hallway at the back of their houses, and that's usually where the ice box was kept. But that was all that they had to eat. And the children were so thin, and I bathed them, and when I was bathing the little boy, his name was Gunnar, I felt so terrible because I knew they were starving, and his little legs were so skinny, and I was almost in tears. So I said, "Oh, goodness me, Gunnar, you're so thin." "Oh, I know," he says, "when I eat, all my food goes to my belly, and hardly any of it falls into my legs." I was almost in tears. So, yes, there was poverty all around us. The young people, the jobless young people suffered the most. They just didn't get jobs, and they'd go on relief, and they'd live in one room in some rooming house somewhere, and they were really hard up. So, and it was quite common to have a knock at your door, and a nice young man, or maybe 2 young men, would be standing there and ask if there was any work that they could do. Of course, what they really wanted was something to eat. So my father would say, "Well, no, there really isn't anything, but you're welcome to share what food we have," and we would give them something to eat. This was just before the war. This happened a lot. There were a few more jobs then, but there was still a lot of young people. And then young people would get married and go on relief because 2 incomes were better than 1. And some of these marriages turned out all right, I imagine, but it was a matter of just having a little bit more money. And when the war broke out, these people just ran to join up because it meant that they would have their income and their wives and families would be taken care of. And to them, they sang all their way to Europe. They were just thought it was great because they would only be there for such a little while. Few of them came back.
Do you see the men at the post office?
I not only saw the men at the post office, I went into the post office with my brother, and of all things to bring them, we brought them cigarettes. In the labor camps, everybody smoked, because we didn't. But my father smoked a pipe, and my mother nagged him about it all the time. But the boys these boys had been in the relief camps, and all they went up into the woods of BC and to build roads. Just young boys. You can imagine how frustrating it was for these healthy young men. There was no entertainment. There was nothing provided for them. They got 40 cents a month. That just barely bought them cigarettes. And anyhow, they were fed up with it, so they marched into the post office. I was working at the time. It was 600 block Granville Street, and you could hear the noise outside. And of course, when we went to go home from work, we had to go to get our streetcar, and the RCMP were mounted, and they had billy sticks, and they were hitting anywhere, anybody, anywhere that was on the street got hit. The horses were right up on the sidewalk. And one fellow was swinging at the guy beside me. He very narrowly missed me. So I ran back into the store until the riot had moved on. And then the boys occupied the post office. So we used to go in our lunch hour, and we'd talk to them. Donald would buy them cigarettes. We'd maybe bring some apples, some fruit. I remember doing that. You could never bring a sandwich because there were hundreds of people. You couldn't bring hundreds of sandwiches. So then the police said, "You're not allowed to do that." And I remember being, when I came out, approached by a mounted provincial policeman with his baton in his hand. Of course, he wasn't using it, and told I was never to go in there again or I would be arrested. So of course I didn't go in again, but I was with my brother. We were walking down to the streetcar together, I guess. Anyhow, they put the boys out of the post office, bodily threw them out, but they went back in. And then they announced that they were going to go to the outskirts of the city, and if people would be kind enough, to just feed them, to give them a little bit of food, and they would take it to the fellows So we were all told, "You're not allowed to do that. You can't. Just to go and stand on the corner with some food, and it would be picked up." Told, "No, you're not allowed to do that. You can't do that." Well, I remember my dad making soup and stew, and he got a lot of what Rogers syrup pails. Syrup came in pails in those days. This would be about a 4-pound pails. And we were just children, so of course we were given the pails and told to go and stand on the corner. And I guess he had notified someone there would be someone on that corner. So we just stood there with the cans of stew, and somebody came along in a truck and said, "Thank you, God bless you," and drove on. And the boys got it. But I remember too, a young fellow across the street from us, very nice young boy. He was killed early in the war. Oh, he was so handsome. Anyhow, he came home that night, and he walked home from town, and his head was just split right from his crown right down to his eye, just split wide open. And his mother wasn't home. He was about 17, I guess 18 at the time. So he came across to our house, and of course Mama and Daddy pulled it together as best they could and cleaned it and bandaged it and saw that he was Donald took him to the hospital for emergency treatment. He had been clubbed by a mounted policeman. All he was doing was coming home from work. It didn't matter if you're on the street, you got clubbed. The provincial policemen were very militant, and they didn't listen to explanations or anything. They just acted. They were just like a gun with a trigger. Just went off. That was it. I know they were not very well liked. I don't know what happened to them. But I guess the RCMP took their place. There were city police too, but imagine they were few and far between and had a hard enough time. They had to call in the provincials, which would be like calling in the army almost, or the RCMP. But that was a terrible time. The Doukhobors had a bad time too, because they made a lot of trouble. They came into Vancouver, and I don't remember what they did in Vancouver, but I know they were sort of rioting and rebelling, and the women were taking all their clothes off, and in order to, protesting. And I remember being out for a walk with my father, and this was, I don't know where we were, certainly on the outskirts of Vancouver, not in Vancouver itself. And this big flat deck truck came along, and it had boards down the side, about 4 feet high, all the way around it. And it was packed full of Doukhobor women who were being taken away. And they were all naked as the day they were born. And of course my father realized what was coming, and what he did, he quickly clamped his hand over my eyes until they went by. And I said, what was it? Oh, nothing, just some silly people. But they were sent to Piers Island. That's just off Sydney. And there was a colony there, and the provincial police were in charge of them. And they stayed there for quite a while. They grew vegetables, and they were vegetarian types, I guess. But I don't remember when they left or how they left. I've probably given them some land in the interior. But they rioted a lot. There didn't seem to be any solution to their problem. No one could figure out what they wanted. In fact, they demonstrated at the Parliament buildings. I guess in the 50s, they all parked themselves at the Parliament buildings. But I couldn't figure out what they wanted. They wanted to practice their own religion. They had that freedom. They had farms. So I still can't figure out what they were after. But they would, put bombs in front of the trains, derail the trains, set anything they could on fire.
Did your political beliefs change during the Depression?
Sure did. When I first voted, I didn't vote Liberal or Conservative. I voted CCF because I was 19, it was 1939, and after seeing what I'd seen, the jobless, the people, suffering, and it just seemed to me that the CCF would help people more than the Liberals or Conservatives had. In fact, one of the Conservatives was a friend of ours. he had a lot of friends who worked for him and with him, and his wife was an extremely good friend of ours. And I guess he turned me against liberals for the rest of my life. Anyhow, there was a lot of favoritism there, and so, of course, if my parents had known that I voted CCF, they would have probably thrown me out of the house. It was absolute obedience in our house. As long as you lived there, you obeyed. It wasn't my father who obeyed, it was my mother. She was the boss.
Are you expecting the news of the war? No.
You just hoped it wouldn't happen. Well, you see, Chamberlain had gone to speak to whosoever. Who did he go to talk to? And we trusted him. We thought that he, really meant what he was doing. And we figured, of course they won't have a war. But I remember it was a Sunday morning. I was still in bed. And war seemed such a final, horrible thing. But I just was filled with dread. Of course I was crying. And people said, what's the matter with you? War's great. Well, we'll get jobs. Everything will be fine. Everything will be wonderful now. The war will make jobs for people. It did. For a time, but it certainly was horrible. I used to hate coming home. Well, some young fellow would ask you to go out with him in a crowd, you get to know him. And then, got my papers today, gotta go sign up, and especially towards the end of the war, the young people, like the war had been going on for years, and the first troops over there were in England, and they were, really trained. But in the end, the young fellows that were sent over were pretty green. They weren't as well trained. And so when they got over there, they rushed all these young recruits over, and they put them in the front lines, because they were just the first over, and the trained ones were in the back. And there were so many of them that got killed right away. They just seemed they had just been there, and then they were gone forever. Never even had a chance to live their lives. It was horrible.
How about the Japanese?
I hate them. There were 2 Japanese school girls in my room in high school, and there were quite a few Chinese, and and there was a black girl who was very friendly, lovely person. She did well. I was very happy to know. And anyhow, these Japanese girls wouldn't talk to us. Girls very well dressed, always right at the top of the class. And we used to walk home with them. We had a long way to walk home, and one day, I don't know why, this other girl and I were walking home with them, and before we came to their house, they said to us, you can't come any further because our parents don't allow us to talk to white people. They were very prejudiced. I don't think that they should have been put in the camps the way they were, although I guess it was necessary, because I'm sure that there were Japanese spies all along the coast of BC. And said that men who were actually in the Japanese Navy had access to all the coast and everything. They could chart it for in case they invaded. And it came pretty close. If it hadn't been for the rocky shores of BC, Vancouver Island, we would have been invaded. by the Japanese. I mean, they sent balloons over us. They shelled Estevan. I think I've written this somewhere.
Yeah, you talked about that.
So they were never really. They had a fish cannery at what did they call it? Fisherman's Bay or something, and past Dunderray, or long way past Dunderray, was the fish cannery, and you could, smell it. So from such a long distance, they kept very much to themselves, and they were rude. I mean, they would push you over to get in line ahead of you. They were rude people. But that was just their custom, I guess. The Chinese people were nice. But we soon realized we weren't very old, and realized that that's one thing, we never believed everything our mother told us. Well, I mean, this business of quickly putting your handkerchief over your mouth when you saw a Chinaman in case you got leprosy, we soon learned that wasn't so.
How were Italians and Germans treated during the war?
Well, during the war, the Germans were all put into they were under, they were not sent away, but everybody knew who they were, and they were watched very closely. And especially the German societies. Like, there was one German society in Vancouver, and one of their meetings was invaded, and they found a large swastika on the wall. Well, I don't know how the people were dealt with. It was all very hush-hush.
Mm-hmm.
But I worked with a girl who was German. She changed her name. They all changed their names. And she had a German name, a little bit of a German accent. And then she married a Vancouver policeman, and he was sent overseas. And we didn't trust her. And I guess we were prejudiced. But you had to be very careful what you did or said. Like, if you got upset with something that, really wasn't fair, something happened to you, like Edgar would tell you to do something, Edgar Saba would say, Peggy, go and do that and that and this and this. Well, it wasn't your job. You didn't have time to do it. You were responsible for something more important. And if you'd say, darn it, it just got me doing this, she'd run right to him and tell him what you said. She was their spy. You had to be very careful then what you said and where you said it, because she would go and tell. And there was one girl that started with Mrs. Reagan was her name. Lively woman, smart. She had 2 children to raise on her own. She was divorced, which was not very common then, considered kind of, if you were divorced, it was horrible. In fact, Margaret was divorced for years before I told anybody. Anyhow, she thought that a union, this time we got a union in. Well, Mrs. Plummer ran to Mr. Sava with it, and he just walked right downstairs. Mrs. Plummer walked by, it was the smile on her face, and her lips, her tight lips clenched together, smile on her face, and she just stood there. And Mr. Sava said, go get your coat, you're fired, get out of here. So how would you feel towards Mrs. Plummer? She was German.
I didn't feel too happy,
No, no, it didn't.
No.
She'd say, I just can't wait for Archie, that was his name, to come home. I love him so much. She loved him a lot, but she loved all the other guys she went out with just as much.
That's right.
Well, a lot of women, it was 10 years, and I'm sure their husbands were not being faithful to them. And I remember we had this fellow in the office, Mr. Davis, very, very British, been to India, I wonder where that country called India was. Anyhow, these two girls had married guys, and the guys had gone overseas. They were just young, and they went out on dates. Just went to a show or went to beer parlors with a bunch of troops, I guess, other guys. Boy, he just gave them a dressing down. They were supposed to stay home, keep the home fires burning, and be faithful to their husbands. They've got enough to contend with without you being unfaithful to them. He really gave them a dressing down because they were going out. Then we knew the girl, lived near us when we were first married. Well, it was the end of the war, and the war brides were coming home, and this girl arrived. Her name was Mrs. Bitts, B-I-T-T-S. She had the most beautiful little boy, and she moved next door to us. The Red Cross had found her a place to live, and she was crying, feeling very bad, because we made friends with her, invited her over right away. I babysat her boy, and we said, what's happened? Isn't your husband coming home? Oh, she said, he came home a few months ago. She said, I just arrived. She says, to be greeted by his wife. Been married all the time. She says, but he married me in England. Because we went through a Church of England wedding. And this little boy was the result. So they wanted her to go back to England. She said no, she wouldn't. I think she figured she could get the guy back. So she became very good friends with us. We helped her out a lot. And then she met another fellow. And she was never married to this guy, so she couldn't divorce him. But she got married again and lived happily. Lovely home, really good husband. He adored her son. The little boy never remembered his real father and never saw him either. But the father, the fellow she married, was such a coward. He sent his present wife, his wife that he'd left here, who had forgiven his infidelities, and his mother down to meet her at the train to tell her that he was already married. Just get on the train and go back to England. She didn't. Of course, one of the other horrors of the war was when I first got married. There was this Robertson family around the corner from us in James Bay. He had a little farm just down on Dallas Road, down where, what is there now? Well, there's all those government buildings down there. Anyhow, I got to know him, from walking kids around, and he had a handsome young son. Oh, he was a big, strapping, healthy young boy. Strong, nice, kind, friendly young kid. He was drafted. He ended up a prisoner of war in Japan, and of course he'd been given up for lost. He was their only son, and anyhow they found out he was a POW, and then the POWs came home, and they brought them by boat to the CNR pier. For some reason or other, they might have put them in trucks or driven them some other way later on, but when I saw them, they had walked up, not marched. They were straggling, and of course we saw that was the Robertson boy. He was bent over, thin, his face was drawn, his eyes were dead. He was so skinny he could hardly walk, and his mind was gone. He didn't live very long afterwards. He was he was just a vegetable. He didn't know where he was or didn't care. That was horrible. I felt like screaming. I felt like screaming out loud. I was so upset about that. I had Ernie with me. He was just a little guy. And the day the war ended, and everybody went downtown. You couldn't even move for people. People were just singing and happy and walking around town. Nobody wanted to go home. Everybody wanted to sort of share the experience, to be there where all the other people were so you could believe that it was really true. And, of course, liquor was rationed. And there was no liquor, and all the young sailors were looking for something to drink. And we noticed that they were going into the drugstores. They'd come out with bottles from the drugstores. And there must have been some tonic or something that had a little bit of alcohol in it. And the druggists were giving it to them. I guess they thought it's not going to hurt them, for goodness sakes, but anyhow, they were drinking it. They didn't need anything to make them drunk. Everybody was drunk with happiness. Didn't want to go to bed. We didn't want to we were just so happy we couldn't even go to sleep because the war was over. It took a long time to get it straightened out, though. The men didn't just get home like that. And of course the shipyards closed down. Men out of work again. A lot of them went back to the prairies. A lot of them stayed.
Did your husband serve in the war?
No, my husband went down and joined up, but he was what they called 4F. He was did compulsory service, which all the men did. He worked in the shipyard, did war work, but he had a rupture, and so he was ineligible. And so they wouldn't take him into the services. They wouldn't take you if you had flat feet. And they wouldn't take you if you had asthma. I mean, you had to be able to march long, long miles. Mary's husband was conscripted, though, and he was no young man when he was. Well, he must have been in his 30s. And he was conscripted and sent back to Montreal. So, of course, Mary didn't worry too much. The war would be over before Bill had to go overseas, But he would have been one of the gun fodder ones, for sure, because it was late in the war. Anyhow, in Montreal he got pneumonia, and they were moved out of their billets. They were going someplace else. And it was snowing and cold, and he had pneumonia. And he told the medic, I've got pneumonia. Too bad, the fresh air will do you good. So he passed out in the march, and his lung collapsed. So, of course, he was hospitalized at a place called St. Anne de Bellevue. And he could hardly breathe. He just panted. One lung, but somehow they got the other lung to reinflate. But if he got a cold or anything, it would collapse again. So he was always very sickly. He was never very strong after that. And he had been working for the CPR, so he went with the CPR, and then he went with the Harbours Board, and he drove the engine. Like he put together all the freight trains, and if some of them had to go to North Vancouver to the other lines, well, they went through a tunnel. So he'd go through the Connaught Tunnel, I guess. and he'd come up at the waterfront and pick up a few trains at the waterfront and freights, and then take them to the freight yard behind the CNR, put the trains together. And he liked working night shift. That's when they did most of the shunting, they called it, and made up the trains. So he worked for on, but he retired very young. I mean, he wasn't nearly 60. But he never complained, but he must have been suffering from this because he smoked horrible tobacco. And he retired, and all he got was $200 a month pension. That was the permanent, and that's what she gets now. Bill's pension is $200 a month. And she said they built their house, and they lived off that pension and finished their house. And she said the dog ate better than them at times. They raised Billy, and they must have had. So Billy, I guess Billy was married when he retired, and they finally finished their house and sold it and made a profit. But she must have got a pretty good price for the last house she sold, because if she can live off the interest of that money, she's doing well, and the old age pension, and pay $600 a month rent. Of course, Freddie, my brother, found out how much she was living on, so he gives her $150 every month, a year in advance, to subsidize her rent. And so what happened? Put her in.